Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Cesal. I am the Community Director for the Data Visualization Society, and this is our Fireside chat today. We're going to be talking about sketching and data visualization. And so, about sketching and data visualization. If you don't know the Data Visualization Society, we are a nonprofit, volunteer-run professional society for people interested in data visualization. It's free to join. Our website is datavisualizationsociety.com, really easy, but we're hosting fireside chats, just a casual conversation about different topics while everyone is, pandemic land and maybe beyond. So we're talking about sketching and data visualization today. And I want to quickly thank Excella for the use of their Zoom. And so they have allowed us to have a Zoom with so many people in it, more so than we could with a normal Zoom. And so we can reach so many more people in recording for us. I am going to let our panelists introduce themselves today. So Duncan, do you want to start?
Sure. So my name is Duncan Geere. I'm an information designer based in Gothenburg on the west coast of Sweden. I first got interested in data visualization, I guess, when I was studying meteorology about a decade ago. But I put that aside for a few years while I built a career in journalism. And then I started coming back to it a few years later, doing more and more data journalism. And over the last few years, I've been doing more data visualization and less journalism. So I don't know if I get to call myself a journalist anymore, but I'm still doing bits and pieces. I spent most of last year working for Information is Beautiful with David McCandless, working mostly on the Beautiful News project. And if you're not familiar with that, then that's basically, it's still ongoing. It's a visualization every day for a year, showing how the world is becoming a better place. So it was a really nice, optimistic project to work on. But a visualization every day for a year means a lot of sketching. But I can talk about that in due course. Today, I'm a freelancer and I work mostly on projects with a bunch of different clients, but mostly focusing on environmental issues.
Katherine, do you want to intro yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Katherine Haugh, and I work as a senior advisor on organizational learning at the Global Knowledge Initiative. And I'm also a freelance graphic facilitator and designer. And I help organizations and individuals to visualize complex problems so that they can see them from a new perspective. And I also train individuals and organizations on how to bring or be more visual in their thinking, communication, and collaboration. So I have been doing sketchnoting for as long as I can remember. I think we'll go into a bit more detail about our respective histories with sketchnoting. So I'll save that for that part, but I'm really excited to be here. Thanks so much for hosting this.
Yeah, we're super happy to have you. And Rasagy?
Hey, my name is Rasagy. I am a principal information designer at Gramener. It's a data science company, and we focus on telling stories from business insights. And I've been doing data viz for a few years. I've worked at a couple of places and realized I really love doing this intersection of data and design. And I generally have a background from engineering, realized that was not fun, gone to design, realized I need something specific in design, stumbled on data visualization. And I also started sketchnoting about a decade back because my handwriting was terrible. And I thought nobody would take me seriously as a designer because I can't even write letters well. And so sketchnoting became a good excuse for me to pay more attention to how I write and stay focused in sessions and discussions. And now I just have an impulse to even sketchnote right now while we talk. So that's how I've been mixing between data visualization and sketchnoting.
Thanks. Just a little housekeeping thing. There's a chat box which you can chat and talk about what's going on. There is a Q&A box, and so any questions that you might have for the speakers, I will be moderating and taking your questions and asking the speakers or the panelists about them. There is also a communal note stock, which I'm going to put in the chat right now. And so you can add your notes to this doc. And if you want to pick up anything the speaker says, that would be great. Put it in there, and then that will be shared after the event too. So add your questions, and I'm going to start off with just a couple of basic ones here. So do you want to talk each panelist about a little bit more about how you got started sketching?
I can kick us off. So I started my journey with sketchnoting, I think, as early as middle school, maybe when I was like 10 years old. I even look back on some of my notes from that time, and I had little stick figures of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and just found a lot of ways to doodle in my notes as a student. And I found that that was a way just for me to stay engaged and to make little jokes to myself of what the cartoon characters that I was drawing were saying to each other. And then that just kind of continued to be the way that I learned throughout my academic career. And when I was in college, I found out that the Disability Center on my campus was looking for note takers to help students who needed additional learning support. And so for all 4 years of college, I worked as a note taker, which I think also really fed to my geekness at heart, because I ended up taking classes that I wasn't actually registered to attend in terms of taking tests and getting a grade, but taking other classes in anthropology or chemistry, a wide range of courses, and to take visual notes in those classes for students and for myself. And so I think that's when it dawned on me that my doodles and the visual note-taking that I was doing was not just something for my own learning benefit, but could be shared and used by others. And I found that to be so energizing, because I had never entertained the possibility that somebody might see value or get a benefit from looking at the sketches and the doodling I was doing in my notebook. And so when I moved to Washington, DC, and I started my first job working at an evaluation firm called Innovation Network, I had the opportunity to work with Anne Emery, who is a data viz specialist who probably a lot of folks on the line know and follow her work. And she looked in my notebook and she was like, you should post this stuff online. I think people would really like to see what you're sketching about, especially with evaluation concepts that can be complex and kind of tricky to visualize and describe. And so with her encouragement, I posted my sketches online and was so amazed to see that there was a huge community already of sketchnoters around the world. There's the International Forum for Visual Practitioners that meets, and tons of different ways that sketchnoting and visual thinking is applied. And so that's a bit of my journey. And now I've kind of built my own freelancing business of thinking about how to apply visual thinking more broadly to communication and collaboration in groups, and especially learning. So similarly to Rasagy, I also have a compulsive desire to sketchnote all of the time. And I'm sure that probably across the panelists, we share that desire to sketchnote on the metro, or, you know, when you're chatting with a friend. I just find myself constantly thinking about ways to visualize my personal and professional experiences and to share that with others. So that's a bit about my story, and I will nominate Duncan to share his story with us.
So my story is much simpler. I have never been any good at drawing or putting any kind of marks on paper. I've never had, I mean, I've always had kind of an interest in art, but I've never been especially good at it or anything. It was only a few years ago when I started doing much more data visualization. I think probably the turning point was when I attended a workshop with Stephanie Posevich and Georgia Lupi at IO a couple of years ago, and they were talking about their fantastic, what's it called now? I've forgotten what the actual book's called. The notebook thing called Observe, Collect, Draw, but yes, Dear Data is the right name for the project itself. So they were talking about how you can draw, like hand draw data visualizations. And that's when I started thinking, yeah, this actually seems like something I might be able to do. So I started doing it and kind of almost forcing myself to start with, just sort of keep up a habit of doing just like a little sketch every few days, even if I didn't have necessarily something to visualize, just drawing like shapes in a notebook that were data related in some ways, little concepts for bar charts and things like that. And now I've got quite a good library of those sketches, and they really inform everything that I'm doing. So yeah, not natural to it at all, but I've kind of naturalized myself to it, I guess.
Nice. I think a similar story on my side as well. I barely did any fine arts or sketching, when I was young, and I always thought I'm going to pursue a passion, coding and algorithms. And it was only when I got into engineering degree that I realized it's probably not something I want to do. And I picked up sketchnoting because I always felt like an imposter amongst the other folks who were so good visually. And I thought I'd use sketchnoting to practice, also not be distracted, because that was suddenly the time when all the other distractions of phones and messages would happen during classes. And I got into design, and then when I went to design school, I really got the pressure of sketching, because till then I never actually bothered. I would make really bad doodles when I was doing any sort of UX work. But it's only at design school did I really get to see how others sketch and how critical sketching is part of their process. I've slowly tried to improve it. I still am terrible. I still very quickly want to jump to a higher fidelity medium. And I'm now trying to push myself to spend more time on paper and fail quickly than really polish, make things, and then realize that this is completely the wrong direction. So yeah.
This is a good question. Can you please define sketchnoting? So how do you guys define that? And maybe
you want to go, Katherine? Are you thinking?
I'm like,
I'll take a stab.
Yeah, please, Rasagy.
Yes, I think note-taking is a common exercise. Something is happening, you're trying to summarize it, make sense of it, and articulate it in some way. And sketchnoting is as open-ended, just using more illustrative elements while you're taking notes. And that would be, I think, a really basic way of thinking about it. There are many other levels that I've seen in which people try and go more visual or abstract in the way they're taking notes. So unlike being verbatim, which is the style that I tend to do a lot, I love, sketchnoting quotes or specific text elements that are being talked about. A few folks go very iconic. So they make icons, they really turn information into visual aspects. And then there are others who do some sense of scribing and harvesting, which doesn't really go direct as to what was talked about, but they try and make sense of it. And those are slightly more abstracted. There's not a direct 5 discussion points. So we have 5 points written in a sketch note, more broader and more illustrative. So that's, I think, roughly how I take sketchnoting. But Katherine, some thoughts?
Yeah, I would say similarly. I think sketchnoting is very broadly the combination of text and iconography. So any kind of shapes, symbols, icons, illustrations. So I think, and it can be applied in so many different ways. I would say that's the difference between sketchnoting and traditional note-taking. What do you think, Duncan?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really a sketchnoter in the same way that you guys are. It's not something that I've ever done a lot of, so don't have strong opinions on it, but it's really cool, some of the work that I've seen that you guys have been producing and some of the others in the community. I'm aware of it as a thing that exists. I've always thought, oh, that might be nice to try sometime, but I've never actually tried it. Maybe after this session I will.
So why is sketching a particularly effective way of communicating information?
I think one reason why it's particularly effective is because it's more human. I think when I see other people's sketches, I feel like I'm looking into the way that they've thought about something, and there's something that feels more relatable and personal. And I think that draws people in a bit more than maybe a computer produced or software produced visual. I think also too, the process of sketching something can be illuminating from a learning perspective. I know we were talking about this a little bit earlier. So kind of watching somebody sketch also, I think, is a really interesting learning experience, and watching how they might understand, how different concepts relate to each other, or drawing with icons or spacing. So I would say the process itself can be illuminating and captivating. And I think that sketchnoting or sketches, data sketches of any kind, bring more of humanity and that they're more relatable in that way. What are your thoughts? I will turn to Rasagy.
Yes, I think I would probably chime in the same things. I find the engagement aspect of sketching in general to be interesting. I think in data visualizations, I haven't used as much of sketching to directly communicate. I've used it as part of my process. But in terms of information or summarizing, I think sketching can be a final output. Some of the work that Katherine does is essentially an illustration that becomes an output, which is what we talked about sketchnoting. And I do feel like some folks are asking in chat to see some of these examples. I'll try and find Katherine's profile and probably share some examples of those in chat. But yeah, in general, engaging is definitely the common thing. It's quirky, it's unique. It also becomes interesting because the same information could be shown differently by different people without putting in a lot of effort in going into a digital software and then creating it. So it becomes maybe a personal element in it as well.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to those very good answers is that I found that showing a client something that is very clearly a sketch gets me better feedback often than showing them a very finalized design or a design that looks to them to be finalized with lots of sort of crisp lines and everything in exactly the right place. When I do something like, when I deliver a design like that, I tend to get feedback like, oh, why is it this color? Or, can we try different colors or something like that? Not feedback about what I want to get back, which is more about the shape and the visual communication. Is this coming across? Is this story being told effectively? I find that sketching is a great way to get clients to think about that kind of feedback rather than the specifics of exactly, your color choices, your line weights, things like that aren't what you're looking for feedback on necessarily at that point in the process.
Mm-hmm. And just to build on that, Duncan, I 100% agree. I think also too, when you can share a sketch, it's more accessible and it feels less finished. It's kind of like a half-baked cookie. And I think it helps clients or partners that you're working with weigh in more visual design. It feels more accessible, more like a conversation. It's easier to make changes. So I think that's a really cool process too with sketchnoting, because I think it invites participation in a way that a finished, beautiful computer produced design feels more polished and finalized in a way, and kind of inadvertently may close the door to that type of collaboration or I guess group sketching or group thinking on visual design.
Absolutely. Yeah, when I can get away with it, I try and get clients to do some sketches of their own sometimes. If there's something that they clearly want to get across to me, but they're having trouble putting into words, I'm just like, just draw it and send me, something on the back of an envelope. And that often helps bridge that communications gap that you often find when you're talking over email or even over a video chat or something.
Yeah, and I've used the same for collaborating amongst teams as well. So a lot of times we have somebody in consulting world, you would have one person who would go talk to the clients and have some perspective, and then we would jump in as designers. And it's much harder to collaborate on a really finished high fidelity piece, but it's so much easier to, less intimidating for everyone to jump in and make really dirty sketches of bar charts. Okay, we could probably make 3, sort of different visualizations here and then a button here. And that just makes it more participatory amongst the team, and then also, like Duncan mentioned, with the clients.
How do you deal with incorporating actual live data into your sketches?
I wish I had answers for that. So I'm really curious to hear better answers. I have generally made assumptions or thought of this is how my data would look like, and so this is how my charts would look like. And I have been sometimes pleasantly surprised and sometimes really disappointed when I sketch something which looks amazing, and then I put the data and it just doesn't make sense. And this happens far more for me when I do data art projects, because there I really am looking for a visual aesthetic or a style without doing data analysis at times. And then it just breaks apart. Everything looks similar, and then I go back and sketch again. But Duncan, do you have some secret tips for us on that?
I mean, I might kind of zoom out from this question slightly and talk a bit more broadly about how I use sketching in my data visualization process as a whole. And there's kind of three different ways. The first is as I mentioned, I kind of have this habit where I'll do some random sketches in a notebook, whether I've got something to visualize or not, every few days by hand. And I try and share those out on Twitter and on my blog so that I can, not so that I can necessarily get feedback on those things, but just almost to kind of force me to do it. I've made a commitment to the people that are following me that I do this on a regular basis. And I've actually been really pleasantly surprised by the response that I've had from those. Those consistently get like much better. Even the sketches that I think are really ugly, they get like a really good, response from my audience. But the key thing is kind of to keep that habit going, because those sketches often inform my later work that I'm doing. And then, the second way that I use sketching is then, as you say, when I've got some data, I'll quite often do some very rough digital sketches, using something like Google Sheets or Raw Graphs or Flourish, like just some free online charting platform. Basically what other people call exploratory visualization. To me, that's just digital sketching. I'll just kind of like dump my data into something, see what it looks like, what shape it is. And then once I've got a few of those digital sketches, I'll then look back at my sketchbook and I'll start thinking about whether there's an interesting approach in my sketchbook that might suit the shape of the data. And that usually kind of results in some more hand-drawn sketches. And then I sort of slowly lock down the broad visual approach that I'm trying to take. And then finally, like when I've got that visual shape that I want to take locked down and, the client is happy with that, then I'll often use a sketching based approach to nail down some of the detail, like what an annotation should look like, or different shapes of bars or something like that. And sometimes that's, again, I do that digitally just by tweaking parameters in code or in whatever software package I'm using. But if it's not so easy to do that, then quite often I'll break out my pencil and my notebook and I'll just try a few things in there instead. And I find that I tend to come up with less obvious solutions that way. Like I get the obvious ones down quickly, and then what's left is the interesting stuff. And it helps me to move beyond the defaults in whatever software package I'm using. I hope that answers at least the question a little bit.
Yeah, I'm still surprised when I see work of, say, Simona Shalaby. She does beautiful illustrated sort of data visualization, right? And I think in her case, I think it's much different because that's accurate data represented. It's just that the style or the aesthetic is still sketched. But I've never had that sort of an output in my work. I've generally used, just like Duncan, sketches to get to some idea, not to really finish and present an idea with data in it.
So how do you use sketching as a collaborative tool?
Can I go first? So I think collaborating amongst a team versus collaborating amongst clients is, I think, the two types of collaboration that I would generally do. Amongst teams, I think it's generally fun because we are trying to nail what something would look like, and the ownership of the final solution or the act of solutioning then becomes shared. It's not just the designer who's going to come and do their magic and things will look pretty or things will just work. And I think we've sometimes iterated where a bunch of us make sketches on our own, come back together, share different ideas, and there's these aha moments from other sketches that we could incorporate. There are some times when you've used online whiteboarding tools, and that's, I think, more relevant today in the COVID situation. So we use InVision a lot for our final solutions. So we also use some tools like Freehand and InVision to do that. Or we just make paper sketches, take photos, clean the photo up a bit, share it, and then use PowerPoint on our screen sharing, call, and then just draw things on top of it. I haven't yet done more collaborative whiteboarding tools like Murally or Miro, etc. But maybe others, if they've done more collaborative sketching, could probably chime in. With the clients, I've generally seen that clients don't want to spend too much time sketching, but they love the freedom to try and make some marks or annotate or maybe explore with us. And that I've generally seen some of these tools also allow us to do.
I would say, in my experience, sketching really helps me with communicating internally and externally with my teammates and with our client. For example, just before this call, I was on a call with my team and a client, and we were talking through kind of a process for something that we're working on. And I just naturally started sketching out the different pieces and kind of the phases. And I shared, like, I'm working on a sketch, can I send it to you? And so that's something that I regularly do, is try to use visualizing as a way of communicating and getting clarity. I think that it's just another realm. Sometimes we miss each other with verbal communication, where whether semantics or something else is happening, other cultural or linguistic barriers are there. And sometimes I find myself doing that, in meetings of like, are we saying the same thing? And in those moments, I'll turn to a piece of paper and say, like, this is how I'm seeing it. This is how you're seeing it as well. And I have found that those have been really productive conversations to have not just me, but others draw as well. Like, to give everybody a few minutes, draw out how you see this process coming together. And I think from an evaluation standpoint, that's a really interesting process also too, of eliciting assumptions, saying like, oh, I didn't realize I was, making an assumption about how these two pieces fit together, people's roles on the team. So I think that, yeah, it's a helpful tool for communication in terms of facilitating collaboration. And I think also learning. There's a ton of resources out there about how just using, pen and paper to commit what you've learned or what you're digesting down, that distillation process of what you're hearing, and then drawing something, even if it's an icon or a small doodle, of how that can help you focus as an aside, but also helps you distill what you've learned. So something that I tried to do a lot is bring visual thinking exercises into facilitated conversations to get people to use visual exercises to document maybe how they're feeling as an icebreaker, or to draw out a challenge or process in a similar way that I described, because I think it can be a great communication tool and also help cement learning and to inspire learning or looking at problems in a new way. What do you think, Duncan?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer. Like, I don't really think I've got much to add to that, and beyond what I said in the, a couple of questions ago about using sketching as a way to communicate with clients and get a more direct line into their brain, into what they're seeing in their brain that they're struggling to put into words. I find it most helpful in that situation, and there I think sketching can be a really powerful tool.
Are there any particular techniques that you use when sketching? And do you sketch by hand exclusively or also digitally?
Shall I start with this one? So I guess my only real technique is that I have a recurring reminder on my to-do list app that puts every few days in my to-do list to do some sketches. And then I just open my notebook and I just take a few minutes. It doesn't take very long to just draw some kind of interesting shapes. Like I have one of my sketchbooks here. This is one with Moomins on the cover that I particularly like. But it's just like, things like this, or different shapes that I think might be interesting to put data onto. Sometimes I use color, sometimes I don't. Sometimes they look really ugly like this. But it's kind of weird because I sometimes have to do the ugly ones to do the pretty ones. It's kind of weird the way that it works like that. But I definitely find that I've got better as I've been practicing it. So just doing it and doing it repeatedly over a reasonably long space of time, you'll get better, you'll get quicker, and you'll start having more interesting ideas faster than you might think. Katherine, what do you think?
Well, actually, so can I have you add any like particular tools or
Sure.
your notebook or any particular things that you like when you do that?
I mean, I love my Moomin notebook, but I also love, so I don't know, I can talk a little bit about tools later on. I basically just have a really short ruler. I have a rotating mechanical pencil, which I love, and I have a Copic multiliner SP. You don't have to use these tools. Like, you can use a chewed up bit of pencil that you found down the back of a sofa in the back of an envelope. Like, you don't have to have fancy tools to do sketching. And I just find that For me, spending a little bit of money on having nice tools to do it has a few advantages. The first is that spending a little bit on it guilts me into actually using them on a regular basis. Because if I haven't used them in a while, then I start getting itchy, and I'm like, oh my God, I spent, you know, all this money on these nice notebooks and I'm not using them. And second is that the nice tools make me enjoy the process a bit more than I would if I was just using scrappy paper and pens. And they give me a kind of weird creative permission, I guess, to do nicer work and work that I'm going to be more proud of. I don't think that I would have been kind of sharing the sketchbook pages that I do if they were done, you know, on the back of an envelope. But on the other hand, you know, if you're using these scrappy tools, then maybe that's a better place to start, because if you can't draw like me, then you won't mind so much if your resulting sketches are a little bit scrappy. There's less of a, oh my God, this needs to be perfect aspect to it. So there's kind of pros and cons of both approaches when it comes to tools, I guess.
I totally agree with you, Duncan. I think four ideas come to mind, since I know that there's some questions in the Q&A about how to get started. And I think it's hard to get started with sketchnoting because it can feel scary and daunting. And so I think something that has helped me is to get inspired. And so I'm really curious, Rasagy and Duncan, where you kind of draw your inspiration from. Something that helps me is just pay attention to like the visual experience that I'm having at all times. Before this time that we're in now, I remember being at the airport and seeing some cool icons on the wall and taking a picture on my phone and saving it in a photo and thinking, oh, maybe I'll try to redo that later. So I would say start with just paying attention to the visual experience that you have, and also find people like Duncan and Rasagy and others who do amazing visualization work, to follow them and see the sketches that Duncan is posting and his weekly to-dos to keep him accountable to. And to just, find people who you are inspired by and try to do what they're doing. I find that really helps me as well. And similarly to what you were saying, Duncan, to be okay with it being ugly. I think that all of my sketches at first hands can be really ugly, looking like chicken scratch. And sometimes I still struggle with that as well, but to focus on making it meaningful instead of making it beautiful. And the beauty will come through the process, but just focus on getting it onto a piece of paper and being okay with it being ugly. And I think that goes to having a growth mindset, I think, about doing sketchnoting, because I hear a lot of people say, like, I can't possibly do this. I'm not an artist. I don't know how to draw. But I think that everybody knows how to draw. You just may or may not know it yet. And once you actually start committing a pen to paper, that you'll, I think, be surprised by how well you can draw, especially the types of things that I'm drawing, like stick figures, shapes, and things like that. It all really comes down to the visual alphabet, which is a set of 12 symbols, like a square, a circle, a triangle, that we all know how to draw. It's just a matter of getting out there and getting in the right mindset to go for it. And lastly, I totally agree with you, Duncan, about giving yourself creative permission. So something in lieu of having that mindset, something I like to do is call myself an artist or feel like an artist in those moments when I am sketching, and kind of like put that hat on, even if it's a bit of a stretch. And ways that I help myself get to that place is by buying, you know, a $3 or $4 pen that's really nice, or as a beautiful place where I keep all of my sketches. So those are just some of the tips about process and ways to get started. Rasagy, I'm curious for you where you draw inspiration from, and any other tips you have.
Yes, I think I'll first take the tools bit, which is I am completely on paper, and I don't use fancy pens. I get, I get some of the good stationery, and I do a lot of impulse buying. And then I have these huge imposter moments where I just cannot get myself to use them. And I've only recently started taking out my Muji stash because I till now have always felt that I'm wasting it on these sketches that are not good. So I'm going to be very frank about it. And I completely agree with Duncan on the fact that no specific tool sets. I strongly don't use pencils. I strongly don't use rulers, and that forces me to make ugly sketches and erase them. for most of my activities which are collaborative, I push people to use things that are not fine. So for example, this particular pen has a really fine tip, and it also has a slightly thicker marker-like tip. And I push people to use the thicker marker tips when we are collaborating, because then that means you don't have to think about, is this line curved right? Is this the right angle? Just make your dirty sketch of what you want to show. If it's going to be a bar chart or pie chart, that's good enough. We don't want to know whether the angles are correct. So I think that's one major tip. The other is that I use sketching as an exploratory process, which means that the focus is to really go wide. And my design school professor always taught me that your first 3 ideas are going to be terrible. And that, I think, is just amazing advice. And it just seems slightly harsh when you start, because you tend to fall in love with your first sketch as a baby, and this is the best. There's no other solution. And I think in sketching, because it's quick, you're not really investing so much. Going really wide helps. So I think that's from a tool perspective. I still haven't moved to digital sort of sketchnoting or sketching, just because I'm very scared that I'll fall into the trap of undoing and redoing again and again. So, which is why no pencils, no erasers, etc. For me, I think I'm still stuck with paper for most of my process. In terms of ideas, that I think is a really difficult question. I completely agree with the whole, good artist steal sort of thing. So I tend to look for inspiration a lot. I love how Georgia Lupi has her Pinterest board, which is categorized by different things. And that sort of randomness, I think, in your inspiration is critical, especially if you're doing more aesthetic data art sort of work. And I find that, there would be metaphors that she uses. If you see Dear Data or Observe Collector, the metaphors are very diverse. I think inspiration can come from anywhere in that front. In terms of doing sketching for data viz or the design sort of work, my inspiration is generally very specific to the kind of UX sketching that I've seen. So I've generally seen a lot of people talk about prototyping. There's Bill Buxton's UX sketching. That was what I started with. And that, I think, got me really into the value of doing low fidelity or working with really low fidelity in my design process. Yeah, and I think that in terms of sketchnoting, there is tons of inspiration everywhere. I started with Eva Lotta-Lam and Mike Roddy, and I love Dan Rome's books, which also make it super accessible. And I think I'm expanding the question to inspiration and references, but that's the kind of stuff that I would talk about.
Yeah, I think on my part, when it comes to inspiration, I take things mostly from 2 like extreme opposites. One of which is kind of very abstract art, and then the other one is like the natural world. And I think like blending those 2 together has probably resulted in some of my more interesting ideas. Like one set of sketches that I did the other day are these ones. And these are like, you can kind of see that there's a bit of a sort of weather vibe going on there. There's like some lightning bolts and some clouds and some icicles or something. I don't know what these are, hail maybe, some snow or whatever. Just like picking a theme and running with it. And yeah, some of them aren't going to look that great, but it's fine, because maybe you'll get one that looks great that you weren't expecting to see. So just, yeah, if you're doing like a set of sketches, just pick a theme for them. If you want something to riff off, then there's all kinds of different things that you can use on that front. Another thing that I really like is old like machine diagrams, circuit diagrams, that kind of stuff. I really like using that. Astronomical diagrams. There's all sorts of data visualization in other fields that doesn't really get called data visualization, but that can be a really, really rich source of inspiration for graphical style. And it's definitely worth looking beyond things that are labeled as data visualization.
I will add just on the tool question that for those who are interested in doing digital sketchnoting, a tool that I really like, I can show you what I mean when I say that. So I do a lot of my sketching on my iPad, but I usually do paper sketching first, then do kind of like a collaboration session with my client to have them thinking visually with me. And then I'll take that to digital. So it's normally the last step in my process, unless I'm doing a live session at a conference or something like that. But a tool that I really like that's free that you can also download onto your phone is called Concepts. And it's a free digital illustration app. So you can even sketch something with your finger on your phone just to get started, in case you want to do that when you're out in the world and you find yourself being inspired by the natural elements like Duncan and want to sketch on the go. Otherwise, I use Adobe Illustrator so that I can bring my illustrations into I use Adobe Draw so that I can bring my illustrations into the Adobe suite for those who are curious about digital tools.
How do you sort of walk that line and strike that balance between being creative and being informative?
Haugh, do you want to take this one?
This is a hard one. Okay. I think depending on who the sketching is or the sketch is for, I tend to tilt the balance a bit. When I'm going for something that I want to communicate or take as a final output to somebody, which is mostly sketch notes, for example, I try and be more informative. And that's just a personal bias that I have, which is to try and add as much information and detail it out. Whereas when I'm trying to think about exploratory pieces, data art, data visualization, the goal is not really to be very detailed or informative in it. The goal is to use it as a way to jump to a better fidelity later, in which case being more creative generally is always helpful. I do have some mental pressure on my side whenever I sketchnote. I can quickly show you maybe a couple months from. So whenever I tend to sketchnote, I think mine are pretty text heavy, and that's moving towards the informative side. And I've seen a lot of people do more visual stuff. So I think I choose. In my case, choosing to be creative when I'm doing data visualization for more options, choosing to be informative when I'm communicating to others with sketchnotes.
Yeah, I think to add to that, what I really do to balance the two is I guess I sort of separate them really. I have my habit of kind of doing the creative work and generating ideas that aren't necessarily tied to a particular visualization. They're just visual forms. And then when I've got something that I want to communicate, I can pull from that creativity that I've done in the past. I've almost got my own little personal library of sketches that I can pull out of. And that very quickly and easily lets me, it lets me do the creativity in advance almost. And then when I've actually got the data, the only thing that I need to do is like look through my sketches and see which ones might suit, are the right shape, can be modified in the right way to suit this particular data set. So bringing those two things apart really helps me. It's almost like, subcontracting it to myself in the past, you know? Katherine, what approach do you take on this?
I would say for me, my process with thinking about the balance between creativity and being informative is usually that I use a couple of techniques in thinking about the use of color and spacing and how I organize my sketch notes, in understanding kind of how our brain interprets visual information that will go to things that are larger first, or things that have more contrast, like black lettering against a white piece of paper. So thinking about kind of the journey that somebody who's viewing a visual that I create might have in looking at it, that they'll look at, you know, this piece first, and then they'll move to here, and then they'll come here. So for example, something that I almost always do is use black for really key points in terms of my lettering, so that the information is clear, like the text, make them larger and spatial. So thinking like first, and then afterwards, there's kind of like a supplementary icons or illustrations around that text that will have color or, you know, an actual illustration that will help kind of round out that point a bit and bring more of the energy of the talk to the viewer. So I think it's a balance. It's definitely a balancing act. And I think it depends also too on the audience. And I think also probably too how I'm feeling in that moment and in interpreting that information. So I would say it's a mix.
Would you talk a little bit about what kind of career options are available for sketchnoting and data sketching, and maybe like what your first gig was or how you got your foot in the door?
Katherine, do you want to take up the sketchnoting a bit?
I'm actually trying to think of my first, well, the first gig I ever had was being a visual note taker when I was a college student. And then that was just to be a note taker, and then I added the visual element. I'm trying to think what actually was my first gig. It might have been with Tech Change. They hired me early on in my career to visualize content for their courses on how to use technology to solve social problems. And I remember even at that time, I was just using computer paper and Sharpie markers. So I didn't even have the fancy markers or the tech. I didn't even know that visual or graphic facilitation was a field of work. So I think in terms of getting started, what I would recommend is to visualize things that matter to you and to post them out there. I've seen like a lot of my friends and people visualizing different COVID experiences or COVID data or what it's like for them now living and working at home, or if you would watch a TED Talk, maybe that you found particularly compelling, or you went to a meeting that you found interesting. I would say to Duncan's earlier point, to just practice as much as possible and to start sketching about something that you find energizing and that you're curious about, or that you want to learn more about, or that you know a lot about. And then get it out there on Twitter. I think my experience has been overwhelmingly positive with the data viz.
Oh no, internet issues.
Ouch. Duncan, do you want to go next and maybe talk
Yeah,
about some freelancing work?
I can jump in quickly. I mean, I sort of went, as I mentioned at the start, I sort of went sideways into data visualization from journalism, where there's a lot of scope to build in small charts and things like that into your work, you know, rather than just making a paragraph of numbers that people have to read, just make a chart instead. And it was basically a necessity to keep people interested in the stories that I was telling. So I learned how to do that, and everything really kind of snowballed from there. But I think the key learning is basically to find ways to apply data visualization and sketching and things in your everyday work. I'm sure there are ways in which most of the people who are watching can do that if you think a little creatively. And I'm sure you'll see the benefits of that. And then from that point, you can deepen your knowledge by, you know, once you've convinced maybe your boss or whoever that this is something worth pursuing, then you can persuade them to pay for you to take a course or something like that, and just go from there. Slide in sideways, don't like try and confront it head on.
Yeah, I think in data visualization, you probably wouldn't get hired to just do sketches. And I wish that was the case, but I doubt it. There are some folks who do hand-drawn data visualization, like Stephanie Pozovic, Georgia Lupi, and their final output is data heavy but hand-drawn. But that's more towards the art side than, you know, working for a client and probably doing it. So that might be a hard way to get into, but sketchnoting is definitely much easier that I've seen. I think a lot of people have realized value of having visual notes of discussions, webinars, actual events. And so you can start by doing it in a small notebook, post it online, build a set of examples, pitch it to another event that's coming, and eventually get into bigger canvases. A lot of people do on the stage or next to the stage sketchnoting, which we tend to refer as graphic recording. Or you could go digital, like Katherine does a lot of iPad, sketchnoting as well. And both of these are good freelance options. You can level it up by going into something called graphic facilitation, which isn't just recording as somebody on the side, but actually driving the conversation through visual sketches live sketches. And I think that's, I think, the best level to get to. And that, I see a lot of demand in Europe. Indian communities have also been growing for that. And I'm sure US probably has similar set of folks who are doing graphic facilitation.
Katherine, do you want to continue your train of thought? You sort of froze in the middle there.
Sorry, I dropped off. What was the last that you heard of what I said?
I don't remember.
Okay. I don't actually remember what I was saying either. Rasagy, can you help me?
You're going through your whole experience of how you got started into the first freelance gigs. Yeah.
Yes, I was.
And tech for change. Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking about, I think my recommendation is to sketch about something that you care about, to, you know, watch a TED Talk, or if you're in a meeting, or if you're particularly passionate or curious about something, to just start sketching that out, and then to share that. I think there's some vulnerability with sharing sketches, but if you can get the courage to share out, my experience has been overwhelmingly positive in terms of the support on Twitter, especially for visual note-taking and graphic facilitation. And there's an amazing community, also on Facebook, and I'll post that in the chat, where people are really encouraging and want to see other sketches. And so I would just encourage you to just get started and find something that you're curious about, sketch about it, and then share in a way that works for you. And please share with us too, if this panel discussion sparks some cool sketch notes or any kind of chicken scratch, all is welcome that you could tag us in. We'd love to see that too.
How do you get clients on board with sketching if they're resistant to sort of this part of the creative process?
Yeah, I think it's basically just about setting expectations, really. Early on in the process, you know, when I'm having the initial discussions, I'll just let them know that part of that process is going to involve them looking at some of my sketches, and, you know, I'll tell them that, you know, these aren't going to be final; they're just going to be sort of broad shapes, and just like making them know that this is going to be something that they will expect. And then I think I haven't had a case where any client has ever responded badly to that. On the contrary, I think they quite like the ability to look into my process a little bit more and see my way of thinking through the sketches. So yeah, just setting expectations, really.
Yeah, I've had some clients who did not really feel that this was the stage for them to look at, and like, this doesn't look completed, show me when you're done the real work. And I think communicating the value of getting feedback early has worked very well for me. So, you know, I generally set expectations saying at what fidelity would you like to give me feedback? We'll decide how much time we would take to really nail this well. Give me early feedback on early sketches, and we probably would not waste a lot of time iterating in the final design. You want to wait, and I can go in a cave and come back with the final finished work, and it might be way off the mark, which means I'll again go back in the cave, draw another final work, and come back, which means longer deadlines or longer timelines. So I think just communicating in this way and letting them pick the choice, which is not really a choice, but, you know, you're giving them a loaded sort of option, works much better than telling them, you know, look at these sketches and give me feedback. That's, I think, worked a bit well for me.
Do you have anything to add, Katherine?
You've both covered it. I would say, yeah, just letting your clients know that that's part of the process early on to set expectations, and letting them know, like Rasagy said, that it will save time and headaches later to make those edits and get feedback in the sketching phase, rather than when things have moved into software or into the digital platform.
Okay, as we're wrapping up, I'm going to have everyone share one, like, inspiration, one source of inspiration, and then we will conclude our panel. Duncan, do you want to start with your one? Can you pick just one?
I mean, not really. I think probably So there's a link that I posted in the chat, and then Rasagy reposted it, which is great. So have a look there if you haven't seen it. But there's this brilliant artist called Austin Kleon, and he has a great blog. And one of the things that he talks about is keeping it on the one. And it's all about the value of just like repetition. And like, as long as you kind of like hit the first beat of every bar in funk music, I'm mangling his explanation, so please do read the link. But as long as you hit the first beat of every bar in funk music when you're playing bass, whatever you do in between doesn't matter. You've just got to hit that one and then just keep doing it. Like everything else that you do is, you know, it's great, but making sure you get those repetitions in is really, really critical to fulfilling your part, you know, your place in the band in this case. And, you know, in data visualization context, that's basically doing what the client needs, basically solving their problems. And by making those constant repetitions, you can enhance your ability to do that, I guess. I don't know if that was a great answer, but yeah, someone else have a go.
Katherine, do you want to go next?
I'm having trouble picking one inspiration, so if you have one top of mind.
Yeah, apart from the ones that we've talked about, I think Paul Klee's sketchbooks were things that I did not realize were openly available, and that's been a great inspiration because you generally see the final artwork, which looks amazing, but the sketchbooks are really ugly, random, you know, exploratory, and that really makes you feel the value of sketching as a process, or, you know, enhancing your process. But apart from Georgia Lupi, Stephanie Pozovec, and a bunch of other folks that we mentioned, I think, in the call. Yeah.
I think similarly, I'm really inspired by this conversation. This has just been so lovely. I'm inspired by you, Rasagy, and you, Duncan. So thank you for sharing about your process. Like this is so enjoyable. I think probably my broad inspiration is just to learn from others and to have a conversation about sketching and visualizing because it's so energizing and fun. I would just echo, I think Rasagy, you brought her up before, but Simona Shalaby's work is amazing in terms of bridging illustration and conveying kind of like the emotion and energy behind certain topics, but also doing so in a rigorous data-informed kind of way. So in terms of balancing creativity and information, I think she is an expert. So yeah, if you don't know her work, follow her. She's incredible for inspiration.
Okay, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Rasagy. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, Duncan. And thank you to all of the attendees who joined us today. This was a great conversation, and it has been recorded. It will be up on YouTube in a couple of days, so you can, if you missed anything, you can watch it again. Okay, have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everyone.